Hi, Joe.
Good afternoon.
Lots of folks already on.
Yeah.
Trying to expand this window so I can see who all is on. Oh, that's not what I meant to do.
We'll just give it a couple minutes here while people log on. Yeah. All right, Heather, I will launch in at your direction if you want to give any kind of welcoming or opening remarks. Otherwise, we can get right to it. Oh, you're on mute.
All right. Yes, I would like to thank everyone for joining again. For sure, for many of you, this is a repeat. You participated in the focus groups or individual meetings that we had, and so thank you so much for joining for this this follow-up report from the team. I do have one item also that I'm hoping that we can just take a moment to honor the life of Darnell Stallworth.
Hello?
Who passed away on December 16th.
Yes. Are you at a Zoom meeting? Yes. Well, did you get through?
I'm gonna see, Joe, are you able to mute Sister Phyllis?
I can, yeah.
It sounds like she might be with somebody at the front.
She's on mute now. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So Darnell Stallworth passed away on December 16th, and I want to take a moment to honor his life. There's a good chance that many, if not everyone, on this Zoom knew Darnell because in spite of his health challenges, which included some mobility, Darnell certainly knew how to get around. We will speak just to his work with SSJNN, although he worked with so many groups, but his contributions to this committee and this project were important. His volunteer work with our Eastside Neighborhood Action Committee, and which was his neighborhood prior to moving to Friendship Towers, and the time he dedicated to mentoring the youth in our neighborhoods, including leading a regular Boys Talk group. We are so grateful that we had him in our lives. We miss him, and we remain mindful that the work we're planning, even through this project, can carry on his advocacy for our neighbors who just need a little bit of help to overcome life's obstacles. So thank you, everybody. If we could just have a minute to think about Darnell and thank him for all of the work that he put in all of our communities. Thank you. Joe, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Heather. And good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everyone is having a good lunch break so far, and hopefully we can provide a little entertainment, a little bit of a refresher, and some critical thinking to the future of Census Tract 19. Again, for those of you that I haven't met, my name is Joe Nickel. I'm a principal at Yarden Company. We are based in Cincinnati. Daniela and Ed from our team are also on the call as an extension of the sisters. And so what we're wanting to do today is to provide a bit of a recap of where we've been, some of the things we've learned from our discussions with you all, from our research and analysis, start to talk a little bit about some of the themes that is starting to shape up for us. And then utilizing those themes and lessons learned, start to evaluate two distinct options for how we might proceed. And it's not to say that as we get into finalizing the direction and come up with the preferred option, that bits and pieces of those two options won't be evident in that. But we have found that for conversation's sake, it's useful to show two distinct options in kind of their purest form to kind of think critically about what we're doing and have an informed discussion about trade-offs and options as we move into the decision-making process over the course of the next month. So as we go through this, a couple of housekeeping items and humble requests. I think first and foremost, if you can be kind of thinking, reflecting on what you're hearing, starting to jot down questions either in your notes or in the chat box. I'm going to ask, in interest of everybody's time, that we keep everybody's lines on mute and we get through the slides, and then we have a discussion at the end. But that's not to say that if you have questions or thoughts, to put them into the chat box as we go, so you don't forget them. This is being recorded. It will be shared as a follow-up to this. Also in the chat are the links to the slides that we're going to go through today. So before I get started, I have a request in the chat box to do a quick round of introductions. There's a lot of people on the call today, so I'm going to ask, for expediency's sake, if Heather, you can introduce the Sisters of St. Joseph, and then if we go around the room, I will call people as I see them on my roster, and if you can just give a just who you are and what you are or who you represent, that would be really great. And then we'll jump right into it. So I'll start with you, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yes, from SSJNN, we've got here myself and Sister Phyllis Hilbert is on the line, Susanna Faulkner, and Margarita Dangle.
Great. Next on my roster is Betsy M. You're already unmuted.
Yes, I am from Erie Cemetery Association, your neighbor from 19th to 26th and Cherry to Chestnut.
Great. Thank you, Betsy. Tom?
Tom Maggio from the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, and we've been a funder in this neighborhood from the early iterations of the planning, and then we've also funded facade work here and neighborhood light remediation down the street on West 21st Street.
Great. Mr. Adam Trott?
Hi, Adam Trott, local architect, and I typically have projects in this area. And plus I have a lot of community activism.
Great. Angie Devine? I will come back to Angie. Christine Bowen?
Hey everybody, Christine Bowen H in St. Vincent, also a board member of the SSJNN and proud neighbor for this tract.
Great. Rachel McCreary?
Hi, I'm Rachel and Pat's here with me too, McCreary. We're from the shop at 19th and Chestnut.
Great. Dave?
Dave Forrest, City Planning Director.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Dr. Suzanne, and I'm going to butcher the last name, Kulagowski.
Yes, I got that right. I'm Dr. Suzanne Kulagowski. I'm the executive director at Erie Dawn. We are on West 18th Street in the Little Italy area, and we also have some transitional housing in that area as well.
Great. B. Robinson.
Hi, it's Dave Robinson. I'm the community and government relations person for EMTA.
Great. Erin Carey.
Hi, I'm Erin Carey. I'm the neighborhood planner for the city of Erie.
Welcome. Kenya.
Hello, I'm Kenya Johnson, the owner of the Learning Ladder Early Child Care Center on 25th and Peach.
Lisa Songer.
I'm Lisa Songer. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for Emergent Care Ambulance Services.
Great. Elle Parmenter.
Hi, Leanne Parmenter, City of Erie Assistant Engineer.
Great. Good to see you again, Leanne. M. Dangle.
This is Margarita. I'm
Oh,
working.
okay.
for the
Sorry.
City
Yeah, of
Building
course.
Code.
Sorry, Margarita. Yeah, thank you. Michael Furman. All right, we'll come back to Michael. Randy Harris.
Good afternoon. I'm a Little Italy resident, and I live in what could be a historic home. So I'm here interested in kind of facade grants and things along those lines.
Great. I believe Heather introduced Sister Phyllis. Sister, do you have anything else you want to add to your intro? Renee.
Hi, Renee Lamus, Chief of Staff to Mayor Schember, City Hall.
Great. Stephanie Seiner.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I work with Erie's Public Schools as a gardening teacher, and I also have a farm that sells produce at the Little Italy Farmers Market.
Great. I believe we got through everybody. Did we pass over anybody that wants to introduce themselves? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you for that. Great turnout today. And let's get right into it. So a little bit of a refresher on what we've been asked to do. It's really comes down to 3 items. First is kind of establishing that North Star for making this part of Erie safer, more enjoyable, and more walkable. To do that, we're focused on 2 different things. One is to create a 5-year work plan that is implementable and achievable, but also bold and visionary to improve the walkability, mobility, and safety of the neighborhood. And then drilling down even further, identifying a tangible pilot project or package of projects that can be realistically implemented starting in the spring of this year. So 4 to 5 months out from now, developing an actual project and budget for it to be implemented and installed. So many of you were part of our kickoff summary back in, I believe it was October. And so this is a bit of a recap of what we accomplished. We were there for a couple days. We got to see the neighborhood. We met with a series of great community groups at Table of Grace. We met with city staff, and then we had a bit of a brainstorming session with the Sister of St. Joseph's. We engaged a lot of people in a very short amount of time and really appreciate the energy and inspiration you all brought to the kickoff. Coming out of that experience, we started to develop an identity for this project. We like to say that we don't just create plans, we create movements. Critical to that, like any kind of campaign, it has to have a visual and an identity to it. So we went off and we built that, arriving at the name Connections for Greater Italy and Federal Hill. We developed the first kind of stages of a robust engagement platform using a Social Pinpoint website. Social Pinpoint is a platform that allows both surveys and interactive mapping to be shared widely and broadly. And so we did that, and it's still actually up and running, and people are, we've noticed, are still inputting their feedback, which is great. So far, as of late December, when we last did our tally, we had over 70 surveys and over 200 mapped comments. So really great turnout to that. And again, that is still open. If you would like to share it with your neighbors and friends, we're still monitoring it as we go through this. So between our discussions, our analysis, as well as that Social Pinpoint platform data that we got back, we were able to start understanding what issues we have to solve together to improve the walkability, safety, mobility of this part of Erie. So just a little bit about where we're focused. Census Tract 19, bounded by Chestnut, 19th State and 26th, just east of the cemetery, kind of anchored in the middle by St. Vincent's Hospital. One of the things that you all kept reminding us of and making us smarter about was just some of the physical elements of the neighborhood that are very memorable in the sense that they stand out from a walkability experience as you're trying to walk, say, down Peach or Sassafras, that start to layer on to one another to challenge or make more difficult the act of walking, just because of lack of people on the street or vacant frontages along streets that aren't always welcoming, such as parking lots or empty lots. Things that generate a lot of traffic and bring people in on kind of peak days like Sundays or shift changes. And so we started layering that on to a map to see what kind of patterns that started to present to us. So first thing that we did, and people talked about the density of kind of anchor institutions such as churches and their corresponding parking lots. So that was the first layer we put on the map. And then in a similar vein, layering on the hospital, which obviously has a big presence in the neighborhood in a variety of ways. It has some big buildings. It has some blank walls. It has some historic walls that are quite beautiful, but it also has a lot of parking, both near it and somewhat off-site. I will say, as an aside, we work in a lot of neighborhoods and downtowns, a lot of which have hospitals in them. From just a purely physical standpoint observation, this hospital seems to be a really good neighbor in terms of how it integrates into the neighborhood. A lot of our hospitals that we work with really struggle with the relationship between a neighborhood and the campus. So kudos to all involved in making that part of the success story of the neighborhood. There are a number of empty parcels, vacant parcels. So these are parcels without buildings on them. You can see in the brownish tone. You can see how that starts to densify the number of parcels that front streets that don't necessarily have what we call eyeballs on the street, which improves safety and a feeling of comfort, as well as providing destinations and origins for people to walk to, from. And then the city helped us with some property assessments from a physical condition standpoint. So these are properties that are either in unsound conditions or in poor conditions. You can see where those start to predominate. And then we layered on top of that crash data, where documented crashes occur with motor vehicles in and around the neighborhood. You can see where those kind of start to populate with the circles. And then lastly, we layered on your insights and your intelligence that you provided both in those focus group meetings as well as on Social Pinpoint to see if there was any correlation between what people perceived or experienced in the neighborhood and these factors. And you can start to see some levels of correlation between what people experience or have experienced or feel as they walk around or try to walk around the neighborhood, and where some of these kind of physical phenomena tend to co-locate, or things like crashes tend to happen more frequently than in other places. So that was really instructive. You also helped us identify what were some of the weakest areas, however so defined, although trying to focus a little bit on what are the weakest parts of the neighborhood from a purely walkability standpoint. And so from the responses that we got from you all, you can see they kind of break into two camps. There were 5 challenges that head and shoulders stood above the rest, but we also wanted to identify some of the top vote getters that fell just below the line under additional barriers. Things like condition of sidewalks, speed of vehicle traffic, fear of unwanted confrontations, not enough lighting, and conditions of intersections and crosswalks to further extend the impact of the conditions of sidewalks were seen as detriments to walkability in key areas. You can see also where those weaknesses tend to become more prevalent on the map. When kind of flipping the question and talking about, okay, what are some of the areas with the most untapped potential? This created a pretty visible crescent shape, starting at the Shops on the Hill in the southeast corner, and kind of gravitating north and northwest as you get closer to 19th. And these are opportunities where people saw where new housing or new infill development, meaning development on already serviced sites, could take place, where property rehab was a real opportunity, beautiful properties that could just needed a little love, or in some cases a lot of love. More and better promotion of neighborhoods and places, beautification opportunities, events and programming opportunities, and historic stories, narrative, and structures. All right, so that was a bit of a snapshot of our analysis and understanding, both anecdotal as well as more hard data. Let's start talking about what are some of the emerging themes that may instruct or guide our work as we move into developing a response. So we developed some statements that are kind of memorable in our minds and start to shed light on where we should focus. The first is edges are a problem and middle is the comfort zone. So the least comfortable spaces that people identified tend to locate around the edges of the property. But the most comfortable was seen as the center of the neighborhood. Corners are your strength. So although a lot of the least comfortable areas were identified in the corners, they're also seen as the areas with the greatest strengths. So kind of interesting that some of our most challenging areas are also the areas where we have our greatest foothold in growing the neighborhood and improving its safety and walkability. So places like the shops and the shops on the hill and the two opposing corners are seen as real strong points on either side of the hospital. That being said, a lot of great work, both kind of entrepreneurial energy as well as planning efforts by many, have gone into places like shops on the hill. But it is not sufficient to say that those places have made it, or that we can rest on our laurels, or that we can focus elsewhere. We can't lose sight of the fact that they continue to need our support as a destination to walk to, as a place to walk within, and a place that I think creates that common heart and gathering place for people to meet, shop, spend time with one another. And so places like Shops on the Hill, and I would also lump in Shops on 19th, continue to need our support, and we'll come back to that and some thoughts we have for doing that. Another overriding theme or overarching theme that you identified for us in a variety of ways was that we have plenty of roads. Many of them are designed to get cars through the neighborhood as fast as possible. And we don't have enough people to counteract the road congestion with sidewalk activity, which leads to us feeling unsafe, unwatched, and in uncomfortable locations throughout the neighborhood. Nobody really likes to walk by themselves. They want to see other people on the streets. They want to see people they know, as well as kind of bump in acquaintances. And when streets are not full of people walking up and down them on a regular basis, that leads to the perception and the reality that they're not that safe. So slower cars, not necessarily the amount of cars, but the speed of cars is the issue, and getting more people on the streets. And then right from this word go, you guys started to hark on some really critical details that I think are really important and often get lost in a exploration into physical improvements in a place, and that the details matter. In the summertime and in spring and fall, not losing sight of the impact of things like planters or lighting in the early morning or late at night, or removing of debris and garbage. In the wintertime, you're obviously a winter city, making sure that at least our primary routes, if not all of our sidewalks, are removed of snow. We spend a lot of time talking about removing snow on our primary thoroughfares for cars. We spend remarkably little time, and this isn't unique to Erie, talking about removing snow from sidewalks. And so figuring out ways both from a homeowner and resident and business owner standpoint to encourage that, but also along key routes, making sure that there's a minimum threshold of clearance that's happening after large snow events. Just as an aside, we chose this photo intentionally on top because snow is also a really important indicator of the pavement that is actually being used by cars. So in this picture, we liked it because it showed a well-cleared sidewalk. That's obviously important. But also notice how much pavement is being obscured by snow that isn't actually required to move cars around the street. And we ask ourselves when we look at a picture like this, what if year-round we were able to capture back some of that asphalt for landscaping, for seating, for places for people, for outdoor dining, things of that nature, that also so happens to slow down traffic and make the act of walking and biking around a neighborhood much safer. So not losing sight of the fact that we're doing a lot of this work in winter. And so I encourage you in your next major snowfall, after the cars have been driving around a little bit, to go out and just start observing what we call sneck downs in the neighborhood, these naturally occurring traffic calming devices that show us a lot about what is important in the right of way. Okay, so those are the themes. And now we're going to get into a little bit of the vision side of this. So this is broken into two kind of chapters. The first, we're going to start talking about the Sisters of St. Joseph as the kind of neighborhood anchor that is obviously our client, but also guiding this process in its implementation. It's important to understand their role in all this. So we have some recommendations based on what we observed and learned relative to that. So they know where they're supporting and where they're leading, but also some priorities. There's a lot to do here, just like many neighborhoods. But how do we start to have a scorecard or a metric for understanding what we're going to prioritize versus maybe leave for somebody else to do or do at a subsequent date? So just to kind of walk through that a little bit, from a vision standpoint for the neighborhood and specifically for Census Tract 19, we want to become the most mobile neighborhood in Erie, kind of flat out. Connecting it to one of the most vibrant neighborhood commercial districts in Erie, both from a place standpoint in the commercial business district, as well as a neighborhood fabric and walkability standpoint. We think the opportunity here is robust in kind of being that quintessential walkable neighborhood that if I'm moving to Erie or relocating within Erie, this is top of my list if I value things like small businesses and retail, walkability, knowing my neighbors, things of that nature. So what is the Sisters of St. Joseph's mission and role within achieving that vision? Obviously, they're a convener, planner, coordinator as a kind of, and we're partners to that as their hired consultants. We're going to elevate and promote inclusive excellence in design and experiences. We're going to leverage our funding and institutional partnerships to make a lot of this happen. And we're going to support our business districts and build on the support that we've already brought to the table and even think about creative ways we can expand that in the future. So how do we hold ourselves accountable? What are our principles for growth? We're going to build on what we've done already. We've been active in the neighborhood for quite some time. So building on our investments happening to the north, and St. Vincent's investments in the center of the neighborhood, and gateway improvements that are already happening at places like 26th and Peach or 19th and Chestnut. We're going to continue our support of current activity centers at the shops, Chestnut and 19th, and at the shops on the hill. All roads go through the hospital, and by that we mean we've got this really large anchor in the middle of the neighborhood. And so when we think about an audience, a user base for walkability, we've obviously got our residents, but we also have the employees of places like the hospital or the schools that are in the center of the neighborhood that will meaningfully contribute to the amount of foot traffic, at lunchtime and before and after shifts. Every internal improvement makes a way to an edge. So if you remember our mapping, the edges were a big issue. And anytime we're making an internal improvement, if we don't also make a corresponding connection to an external improvement, we will continue to have these nagging perception issues of people not familiar with Census Tract 19, maybe not comfortable or used to going through that part of the city. And so making sure that we're making visible at our edges any kind of improvement that we make internally. And then this probably goes without saying, but it's important to write, that improvements benefit all users, bicyclists, walkers, mobility challenged people, in addition to drivers. Our experience have shown that if we make this a great place for people outside of cars, then it gets it better for people within cars as well. So those are kind of the whats and the visions. Let's talk a little bit about some of the tangential or external whys. You know, the moral whys are hopefully by this point self-evident, but there's also some clear data from work done nationally and maybe in some cases elsewhere in Northwest Pennsylvania, where the impact of this type of work that we're all talking about can readily be felt in a variety of channels. So first and foremost, well, not foremost, but first on the list here is that walkable neighborhoods are a huge value generator for neighborhoods. And so if we're thinking about building equity in homes that we own for the portion of the neighborhood that owns their own home, a more walkable neighborhood has a direct impact to the value of that property. On a similar token, office, retail, and apartment values increase 1 to 9% for each 10-point increase in the Walk Score Index. This is borne time and time again. Now, some of you might be looking at both those two numbers and ask yourself, will that put price pressures on our residents, for instance, or small businesses that are very price sensitive to increases in things like rent? Possibly. And we have to be mindful of that if we're making improvements that are going to put pressures on existing owners, residents, stakeholders, business owners, that we have to have some corresponding tools in place when those pressures start to be applied, that we can mitigate them. But that is not an excuse or reason to not make these types of investments. The third item here is talking about spending patterns and focusing on bikes for a moment. People who ride bikes to accomplish everyday errands and out for entertainment purposes as well as recreation have been shown to spend almost 30% more than or 25 to 30% more than folks who drove to that district. And that's predominantly because of two things. One is if I'm taking my disposable income and reallocating it from operating a motor vehicle, which is a significant expense, to operating something cheaper, like a bike, I have more to dispose of and use for things like entertainment and other uses. But also, when you drive to a place, you're more likely to make what we call a destination trip. Drive to the spot, do what you need to do, get back in your car and go elsewhere. Whereas people who walk or bike to a place are likely to pass other businesses or other uses or destinations that either they didn't know they wanted to do, or reminded them that they needed to do, and so they tend to spend more on a per trip basis. Obviously, the economics of this are just one sliver of the pie that we keep in mind of as we're thinking about these types of investments. Safety is even more important than that in our minds. And so when you think about modifying streets, for instance, road diets that reduce the amount of space dedicated to moving cars, which isn't to say that's necessarily removing the capacity of those streets to carry cars, have a dramatic impact to the types of incidents we see associated with faster moving streets, 47% as a matter of fact. And so when you think about the safety as well as the kind of physical costs and tolls that crashes take on people, that's significant. And then from a health standpoint, people who live in walkable neighborhoods are twice as likely to get the recommended daily activity without necessarily having to pay to go to a gym or buy that treadmill or things like that. We also wanted to pull out within that kind of trend analysis one key element that is important to this process, which are kind of lighter, quicker, cheaper responses to dramatically moving the needle on things like safety and street activity. I mentioned that part of our scope in this work in 2023 is to implement some of these low-hanging fruit projects. Well, one of the tools to do that are things like asphalt art and small accompanies to that reshape the way a road looks or feels. So these are things like crosswalks or what we call bump outs, where we're extending the visual extent of the sidewalk out into the street, identifying places like on-street parking, mid-block crossings, things of those natures. A lot of that can be done with light and easy to install equipment, as well as what we call asphalt art, so painting the asphalt. And you can see from a recent analysis last year, the impact that even those small modifications to the right-of-way can have on street safety and performance. So this is a bit of an aside, but we thought it was important to just bring you all up to speed on some of the things that we're working with the Sisters of St. Joseph on to make sure that this isn't happening in a vacuum. You all have been great kind of core group to guide this work. We also want to make sure that, going back to that idea of creating a movement, that our engagement doesn't start and stop with this group. We've got a great start in the identity and branding of the project, as well as the social pinpoint online, but that doesn't speak to everybody yet. And so coming out of the holidays, early here in the new year, we've got some additional ideas for broadening that engagement, and again, broadening that movement of understanding, support, enthusiasm, and ultimately, when we get to building something, partners in building out whatever it is we identify is important. And some of the tools that we've developed from a collateral standpoint to support that, using that identity that we've created. All right, so you may be thinking that's taking a lot of time to get through all this, but we think that's really important to understand and ground our look at options when we start thinking about what are the specific physical things we can do to parts of the neighborhood, parts of Census Tract 19, to dramatically improve the walkability, safety of that part of Erie. And so to do that, our primary lens, again, given our scope, is to look at a 5-year achievable work plan. And so that kind of acted as a filter to the robustness of any one initiative that we're putting forth. We're not proposing, just to be dramatic for a second, we're not proposing a new highway interchange or even a new pedestrian bridge or things that have been talked about that are really important, but probably outside the scope of what we're principally focused on. We should support those things, but that isn't the principal focus of a 5-year work plan. And then I mentioned at the outset that our options for conversation's sake today have been pushed into kind of 2 distinct camps that are both important when we think about improving the walkability and usability of a neighborhood. And I shared some of this when we were all together in October, but to repeat myself a little bit, there are 2 kind of factors that really drive walkability. There's the routes, the experience of getting from point A to point B, and then there's the quality and activity of A and B themselves, the destinations that we want to encourage people to walk to. It's really hard to talk about walkability without both the infrastructure of doing it and the experiences of what happens once we get there. And so our 2 camps that we've separated our options into kind of fall into going wide on routes or going deep on destinations. And I think it goes without saying at this point that at the end of the day, we want a little bit of both, but for clarity's sake, we want to be able to talk about them each in their pure form. So first, on option 1, we're taking a look at how do we better connect places in the neighborhood, going wide on routes. We've broken this up into a series of kind of distinct initiatives within that. So the first item within that is what we're calling the Lifeline. And LIFE is short for Little Italy, and then the FE in Federal Hill. And what we're trying to do here, if you remember those 2 points of strength that you all identified, the 2 corners, northwest and southeast, how do we better connect those 2 corners through major institutions and employers like the hospital? And how do we take walks along routes that have been told to us are the most enjoyable today, but just still need a little bit of oomph and refinement? They're not as hilly or steep of hills, I should say. And so what we've identified is that primary route that would kind of create a connection between one end and the other, and some improvements to the kind of existing barriers to that walkability from an intersection standpoint, where barriers to walkability are most readily felt. If I don't feel safe crossing a street, that's really going to hamper my ability to walk. So that's the first element to this option. The second takes a more of a outside looking in approach. How do we connect what's around us more into the heart of the neighborhood on a kind of thoroughfare basis? And so what we're looking here, kind of tongue in cheek, called the SAS Pass, is how do we recapture some of the excess pavement along Sassafras, along the eastern side of the street, so along the curve of the eastern side, to create what we call a two-way cycle track. And a two-way cycle track, just to boil it down, is essentially an on-street trail that's protected by barricades. The outside lane of the trail goes along in the same direction of car travel, so there's no confusion from a user standpoint. And what we see as a possibility here is to connect kind of major destinations within the neighborhood to destinations north of the neighborhood, while dramatically improving things like gateways into the neighborhood at both the north and the south. If you remember, even between 19th and 18th up in the north, there's this big chunk of kind of unclaimed street territory that is probably left over from some kind of infrastructure project that frankly doesn't need to be there as a street facility, and could be rethought of maybe in the future as more of a public space that connects 18th into the neighborhood. And then the last element on this, or I don't think it's the last, the next element on this is what we're calling the 19th Play Street. So 19th has been identified in all the kind of city planning that's taken place as a primary east-west corridor. And so we wanted to not only acknowledge that, but capitalize on that as that plan gets implemented over the next decade. This is one of those areas where a really important piece of infrastructure, a dedicated trail bridge over State Street on the eastern edge of the neighborhood, has been talked about. And then how do we improve that sense of arrival if you're coming over State, landing in 19th, and Census Tract 19 rather, along 19th, and creating a really safe and enjoyable street to walk, bike, play on. 19th is an interesting street. It doesn't carry a lot of traffic right now. Traffic that is on there tends to speed, but that we can manage through better design. And we think that there's an opportunity, maybe not to create a trail here, a dedicated off-street trail, just because of the right-of-way is fairly constrained, but to design the street in such a way that all users, whether you're an 8-year-old kid on a skateboard or a bike, an elderly person scooting or walking down the street, or even a driver, kind of knows that this is a place for all people to kind of be out on the street, walking, biking, rolling, and driving very slowly. And so there's some street design things that we can do to reinforce that act. And that gets really important as we get into kind of some of our commercial districts, for instance, say along at 19th and Chestnut at the shops. And then on Chestnut, this is another, this is more of a management initiative, but really important to really clarify and strengthen the kind of rules of engagement, the rules of the road, as it were, for Chestnut Street. Right now, it's a little bit of a Wild West from a parking standpoint. It has made it very difficult to not only drive up and down and find parking, but also, maybe more importantly, to walk across the street to go walk through the cemetery or vice versa. And so we think just refining the way, what we call in our language, curbside, the way the curbside functions from a parking management standpoint is really important, as well as addressing some of the key crossings so that it is safer and more visible to cross that street to such an amazing destination in the cemetery. And so when you layer all that together, this is what a going wide on routes would look like. If you were just to focus purely on infrastructure, this would be kind of the package of 5-year initiatives that we would recommend. And then within that, we thought it was important to just create some hypotheticals around what could conceivably be addressed within the next year. And so we think a segment of that Play Street could be explored. We think improving some of the key intersections that are along that route that connects the two corners. And we think the parking management or curbside management along Chestnut would all be fair game in the next year. All right, option 2. This one, again, we're going deep on the destination. So we've talked about going from A to B. Let's talk about A and B themselves. So the first piece of this is looking at that northwest corner, the shops at 19th and Chestnut. Here we're trying to strengthen relationships and double down on kind of the energy that's already starting to take place there, connecting things like the farmers market along 18th, Ruby Shaft Park, the shops themselves, the entry into the cemetery, further down Chestnut, and then the entry into the neighborhood more broadly speaking beyond that. So here we think we can calm traffic, beautify and activate frontages, flower pots, signage, lighting, things like that. Connecting the farmers market back into the neighborhood, support the growth and programming of the market and the shops, activate the park itself, maybe remove some of the elements that make it feel like it's less safe than it is, and make some key intersection improvements at either end. At the other end of the other corner of the neighborhood, some similar elements are being deployed when we look at the shops on the hill. Obviously, we want to calm traffic and beautify and activate frontages along Peach, calming traffic probably being the chief among those things through things like bump outs, landscape, narrowing the overly wide lanes that go through there, not necessarily removing lanes, but narrowing them down to more of a humane dimension. Making intersection improvements at key places that connect this environment back to the hospital and beyond. Finding key areas for landscaping along 25th to improve that even further. Thinking more into the future, this would take a little longer to implement within the 5 years, but thinking about this alley network, which is really interesting series of spaces and building frontages that could be part of the life and activity of the shops on the hill, as well as another connection. Finding some opportunities for facade improvements along this stretch, and using our facade improvement resources to help achieve that. Exploring strategic property acquisition could even make sense here potentially as a way to control the destiny and make sure that we're supporting our retailers with all the tools that we can, with new high quality space coming onto the market alongside them. And then dedicate an events and promotion staff member. This is getting back to the master plan that exists for this distinct area, finding ways to actually implement that. And one of the ways that we can do that is actually create a staff member that wakes up every day thinking about how to elevate the story and marketing of this really special environment and the uses along it. Could be an easy way to address that issue. So if you look at these two corners on one map, that's what that starts to look like. And then in 2023, if we were starting to think about this year, what would likely be possible within that time frame. There are some easy to build and implement public space elements that could happen in one or both of these locations. There are some programs we can implement around improving signage, lighting, and paint to both the facades and the public right-of-way within each of those environments. And then, as I mentioned, hiring and utilizing a staff position focus on marketing, storytelling, and event promotion in organization would be a real big win for each of these destinations. All right, so it is 12 minutes to 1. We have a little bit of time left. Before I open it up, and I have not been monitoring the chat, Danielle, I believe you've been taking a look at it. We can have a discussion with the time that we have left. This will not be the last opportunity to discuss this. You have these slides now. What we're going to ask is that any kind of feedback that you all have, that you provide it to Heather and Susanna and Margarita at the Sisters of St. Joseph, and they will consolidate and collect all that feedback so that we can go from having a series of options to having a draft preferred option when we kind of combine what we've learned here today. And then we will get back in front of you after that process is complete with a draft proposal for how to proceed. So I think what we're going to ask is that if you can take this kind of material and the conversation that's generated from it for maybe a week's time, maybe we give ourselves till Friday the 20th to get that feedback back to our client, that would be really great. And so thank you in advance for listening today, but also reflecting on these ideas and identifying what might be missing or what you think you want to prioritize. So with that, I'm trying to think the best way to accomplish this. Maybe we can use the hand raising function and start to call on people who want to bring forth some of their thinking to the conversation. And Daniela, I'm going to empower you to call on people and unmute them if they don't unmute themselves.
Yeah, we might want to start. Dave had a couple of things, I think mainly around, and you know, we've thought about this about, you know, are there some examples in Pennsylvania when it comes to the asphalt art where they've kind of already gone through kind of some of the headaches around getting those types of projects implemented? Yeah.
Well, I know this is dangerous to say sometimes in Erie, but you're lucky being down the street from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has a new team, well, relatively new. They've been around for a few years now, called DOMI, Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, that have really taken street safety by the horns and have made it their mission to dramatically improve the safety walkability of not just some areas of the city, but the entire city. And they have implemented and utilized asphalt art a number of times to great effect. And so seeing examples of how that's worked in Western PA, you don't have to travel far to see how that could work.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in here. Sorry if that's not what you want. This is Dave. So I'd like somebody to send me contact information for somebody at DOMI.
Okay, great. Happy to do that. We worked with them on a project last year, so we know them pretty well.
And just broadly speaking though, is the asphalt art consistent with standard traffic regulations or not consistent? And how do you reconcile those?
Yeah, good question. Very practical one. So the Manual for Urban Traffic Control Devices is in a period of transition. It to date has not been very supportive of proven metrics and tools to improve safety within streets. And that's part of the reason why it's up for reconsideration right now. But where we tend to focus isn't necessarily on the traffic control devices themselves. And to de-jargon that for a second, that's crosswalk bars, stopping bars, even the internal workings of an intersection themselves, although there are numbers of jurisdictions around the country that have successfully done those, but to focus mostly on the edges of streets that are less in the purview of that guidance in whatever form that it fits. And so that's where we have found the greatest success. So painting bump outs, for instance, is much easier to reconcile with the current regulations than dramatically painting an entire intersection. And so there's that. Two, there's also very standard implements like stop signs and stop bars and just improving standard crosswalks. I'm going to ask you to put yourself on mute if you're not active in the conversation here. Thank you. That are just flat out missing from the neighborhood. So standard piano key crosswalks, for instance, very effective safety device, just flat out don't exist. They're easy to implement and should be more, more widely used within the neighborhood. Also things like stop signs, four-way stops. There are ways to pilot those rather than going through an extensive warranting process that we would recommend we explore if we do go that route to see if they work or don't work.
So Joe, I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize the time, but if this is important, are there cities that actually wrestle with these things and come up with some of their own local design standards for the things you're talking about, streetscapes, crosswalks, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and DOMI may be a good starting point. They've got their own kind of internal standards and they're in your neighborhoods. So maybe we start there and go out from there. Anybody else? I'm just scanning the chat here. I haven't looked at any detailed comments yet, but it looks like we've got a kind of robust conversation going on the chat. So that's great.
Dave, I have a question for the options. This is Giselle with Tipsy Bean. You've got option 1, option 2. Is this an all or nothing on either, or is the end result going to be a combination of these two?
I think if we're doing our jobs, think of it as like picking from 2 parts of the menu to create a meal. I think we want to hybridize the best of both. As I mentioned before, it's really hard to improve walkability just focusing on one or the other.
I completely agree, and that's why I was asking. And as far as like involvement from the businesses themselves, because I am one, and as the head of the Federal Hill Collaborative, my top concern obviously is like what you've listed off as a lot for everyone's concern is the traffic mobility, the speed, because I agree 100% and have for years now about doing the asphalt artwork to slow traffic. And I love I can't remember what you called it, the schnecking or something like that.
Schnecking is what happens in movie theaters. Neck down is the snow thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something I had never considered before. I had considered doing something in the street directly in front of my shop, because we did find we are allowed to kind of take up our own parking spaces. But with people going, I like that somebody posted the average of 43 miles per hour. It does not make someone want to sit along the street to do that. So I hope we can really consider the factors that we end up moving forward with, how they coincide with the other factors, because one would not make sense without the other being changed.
Yeah, agree.
I don't know how to raise my hand, so I'm gonna have to jump in again. I'm sorry. It's Dave. Joe, where do you think the investments would result in the greatest potential for further private sector investment?
Yeah, I think it depends who you are. So if you're the city and your domain is obviously within the public domain, the greatest investments you can make, I think, are in slowing traffic, so narrowing lanes, and more clarification around where on-street parking and crosswalks occur. And that's usually a striping plan, and in some cases, flexi posts or other types of bollarding that can cheaply be installed. And converting as many free-flowing intersections into 4-way stops as possible. That's where I'd focus most of my energy from a city standpoint. Getting into things like dedicated bike lanes and cycle tracks and trails, those are all great, but just trying to focus on biggest bang for the buck, that's where I would start. From the sisters standpoint, I think it's more operational support, supporting the 2 business districts, supporting facade improvements and operations like the marketing position or the promotion and events, in addition to small business resources, in addition to everything else they're already doing. But again, focusing on these 2 areas. And if you're a business, as was just mentioned, as those things start to happen, figuring out ways to not only promote my own business, but figure out ways, if I'm a dining establishment, to have on-street or near on-street dining, small events, collaborating with other businesses. That it's hard work waking up every day, keeping a shop running. So finding ways that just take what you're already doing and making it more visible is where we tend to focus. And so it really takes everybody. And then from the resident standpoint, organizing, things as simple as walk, bike, run clubs, but also organizing cleanups, and even participating in the volunteer building or installing of some of the things we've talked about are really important. So we've got about 60 seconds here. Daniela, I'm going to put you on the spot. And as you've been scanning this, is there anything that you think?
So we've had Lisa Songer with her hand up for a bit.
Okay, Lisa, thanks.
Years back, I was involved with the Downtown Partnership here in Erie. And they did a lot of different focus groups. And I know that there was some concern with the painting of the streets. And it had something to do with visually impaired. So I don't know if you are familiar with any of that. And if that is an issue. And I just have one other comment, totally different, but related to that 19th Street corridor. I unfortunately wasn't able to be here in October because I was out of town, but walkability with that, one thing that people need to be conscientious of is that's where the ambulances come out, is onto 19th Street.
Yeah.
So just watching for those.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's why I think, and I appreciate that reminder, that's why we think our initial focus on 19th isn't in your backyard. It's probably further west than that. It may not be a one size fits all for that entire stretch. And then on the first question about the visually impaired, I think maybe to state the obvious and be a little bit flippant about it, a poorly delineated and constructed pedestrian network is not good for anybody, especially the visually impaired. And so that's obvious. But when it comes to some of these implements that we've talked about today, there are some key details that as we get into more robust conversations about infrastructure improvements, and particularly crosswalks, things like ADA ramps, truncated domes, which are those little pebbly surfaces that you see when you approach an intersection on a newly built street that are typically part of that, where there are crosswalks that have stoplights associated with them and crossing signals. There are examples of where that's been done with the chirps or some kind of audible messaging that accompanies that. Those have to be done carefully, but those also can be a really great way to improve conditions for the visually impaired. So yeah, good question.
Thank
And
you.
then, was it Adam after that, Daniela?
Yes, Adam Trott.
Hi, just quickly, the DNA of this neighborhood as compared to other neighborhoods, sometimes planners tend to try and identify where the community heart is, a site or facility that you would consider the community's main gathering place. Was there ever a sense of that existing in this neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the answer is one. I think clearly the two corners jump out from a kind of common gathering spot where people kind of can know where to meet. The shops on the hill, the shops at 19th. Obviously the cemetery comes to mind as something that was, and Whippy Dip right next to it, were these common kind of gathering places that were really important. And then maybe your question was more geared towards civic space and public space. You know, the park along 19th, Ruby Shaft, was talked about as a place that could be better if improved, but isn't there yet as one of those central gathering places. But the idea of identifying and building whole cloth a brand new public park or public plaza, it was not a kind of emerging theme or priority that came out of our analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If we have time, I think Eric wanted to say something.
Great.
Did, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Okay, two things. So I've been involved with this type of thing for quite a while. And we see a lot around all of Erie that people are really concerned about, you know, drivers' behavior, and that's multi sort of elements to that. But they drive too fast, too careless, all that sort of stuff. And you know, and I'll tell you what, I lived in Pittsburgh years ago, And the drivers in Pittsburgh were a lot different, a lot better than drivers in Erie. I've lived in a number of cities. I've never seen drivers as aggressive or just careless. And in the past couple of years, it's gotten much worse. So I just wonder, especially in residential areas, or like, let's say this section in Federal Hill, is there anything that you know of beyond, you know, and we've tried the crosswalk thing where the lights flash or whatever, however the thing functions, but it doesn't work. People ignore them. It's well documented that we had that sort of element down on the Bayfront Highway and Cranberry Street. I've done it myself. Quite often you can hit that button, the lights will flash, and sometimes people will stop. They'll see you either walking or biking and they'll stop. But quite often they're in a hurry and you're not important. So, you know, I don't know, is there an element that you can press a button and when they cross over, you know, go beyond where they're supposed to go, like a bazooka hits them or something like that, you know? And I'm pretty sure if we did that for maybe a year or so, maybe it would help change it. I mean, really, it's epidemic here. But also the second element to that is I've seen in other cities where people get real creative with paint and they can create some amazing illusions on the street where you want to cross or you want them to slow down. Have you seen any of that type of element?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's the, you've probably seen examples of this where there are crosswalks that look like are floating 6 feet above the street, just based on the way they're shadowed. Yeah, those are fun. You know, to Dave's earlier question about acceptance by the traditional traffic control device manual, that would fall outside of that. So those are usually done on private streets or on small local streets that don't experience a lot of traffic. But there are some key basics that just improve behavior. To quickly get to your question about behavior, we work all over the country. Every city's residents feel like they are the worst drivers in the country. And that every other city has better driving. I lived in Pittsburgh for a decade too. I think I had mixed results relative to people driving there. But anyway, the driver behavior in Erie, and I'm not going to talk about Erie as people, I'm just going to talk about the physical conditions that incentivize behavior, have been heavily incentivized and preconditioned for speed. The streets are wide, they're fast, they aren't very active from a business standpoint in many cases. There's not a lot of friction there that is going to incentivize my behavior to get to slow down. And in fact, a lot of the street grid has been optimized to get people in and out as fast as possible. And so that starts with having a different set of priorities with how we think about our streets. And I think a lot of what we're doing in this exercise together in this work that's so important is starting that reprogramming work, working with a city staff that I think really wants to see that kind of change and acknowledges that historically our priorities have been maybe different, and that particularly in a neighborhood, we're not in a heavily destination tourism area, or certainly not at the Bayfront or even downtown, that our priorities should be more localized and maybe not focused on high-speed cut-through traffic. And so that takes commitment. It takes commitment of the neighborhood stakeholders, but it also takes commitment by your partners down at City Hall and in the departments. And so I think the stars are aligning here, and you've got a great fulcrum around the Sisters of St. Joseph who understand all those moving parts and can begin to change that body language locally within the neighborhood. I have to apologize. We're about 10 minutes over, and I have a 1 o'clock after this. But again, I want to really appreciate everybody's time and enthusiasm, energy, and insight brought to this. We look forward to picking back up with you all after we've made some refinements based on your feedback. And so I look forward to seeing everyone again, probably in about 4 to 6 weeks. And
I'm jumping in there again because I'm very rude. Can Heather, Leanne, and Aaron and Renee stay on if they're still here, if Renee's still here?
Sure, Daniela, do you mind making Heather the host so that they can continue on with their conversation? I think that might be possible.
Yeah, I can do that.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So thanks again, everyone. And until next time, looking forward to getting to the next step.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Wow, look at that. Wow, that was exciting. I don't think I've ever seen something so exciting.
Everybody just jumping ship. It's still recording. Should I keep it recording or turn that off?
I guess you can turn it off. I mean, I'm not sure I have any strong feelings about it, but